Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today's lecture looks at the period known by historians as the Nationalist decade, running from about 1927, when the rupture between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party started, and then ends with the Japanese invasion of coastal China from Manchuria that began the Second World War. The key theme that many historians explore in this period is state building and the efforts of the Kuomintang to end warlordism and establish an effective government capable of centralizing power and also continuing China's modernization that we explored with the late Qing in areas such as industry, technology, and the development of a very urban society. From the vantage of hindsight, historians of China love to argue about why Republican China failed to establish a stable regime and what basically powered the communist revolution that's going to usher its downfall in 1949. Secondly, historians like to look at, go backward and forward to analyze Republican China, asking how the state and society were either constrained by the classical heritage of the imperial dynasties, or, despite being bitter enemies, that the CCP and Kuomintang, or Zhang and Mao Zedong, had essentially common goals and aspirations and even influenced each other's style of governance. The last thread of inquiry by historians is kind of a revisionist strain that looks past its inability to contain the spread of communism or repel Japan's imperial designs to actually look at the areas where the Kuomintang found great success. After all, the Kuomintang, despite its failures, manages to live on in Taiwan in the shadow of mainland China and eventually emerge from a dictatorship for decades into a vibrant liberal democracy that is home to a Chinese society by the end of the 20th century. And so here highlighted are those kind of critical questions that historians typically explore when assessing the Nationalist decade and then its legacy and impact in the aftermath of the 1930s and 1940s. To kind of take a closer look at that reappraisement of Republican China, this slide highlights that much of the analytical attention that most people focus on when addressing the problems of the Kuomintang concern its inability to establish a presence in the rural areas or to meet the needs of the commoners, the vast majority of people still living in the countryside, even though we talk about greater urbanization. They might focus on the corrupt and ineffective state that's put in place, particularly when addressing issues like currency or the post-war inflation. Or often, a lot of times, historians are going to highlight kind of the narrow-minded focus of Chiang Kai-shek or Zhang Jieshi on exterminating the Chinese communist presence that cost him the approvals of intellectuals, youth, and the average citizen who were clamoring for a united front against the encroaching Japanese empire in the 1930s. Still, the revisionist strain that's come about has been able to focus on a number of areas in which the Kuomintang was actually a fairly successful regime, especially when compared with the warlords or the regime of Yuan Shikai, or even kind of the late Qing era that was presided over by the Empress Dowager. And to do so, they kind of focus on its successes in foreign relations, where the government capitalized on the ongoing rights recovery movement and explosive nationalism of the 1910s and 1920s to eliminate many of the inequalities of the treaty system. A second fact was that in their initial years of cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang did in fact, to some degree, smash and eliminate warlordism and reunify much of China proper under a central government for the first time since the fall of the Qing. Okay. As you all have read by now, the roots of the Kuomintang and Republican China are generally traced back to the rise of commoner from Guangdong Delta to a revolutionary doctor, Sun Zhongshan, or Sun Yat-sen. By the early 1920s, though, Sun was at a low point in his career. His dreams of a Chinese republic had been dashed in 1912 by the machinations of Yuan Shikai. And even after Yuan's death in 1916, Sun proved unable to outmaneuver the militarists and warlords. Nor could he ever really succeed in gaining the strong patronage and recognition of Western powers. So out of options, he joins forces with the Comintern in the Soviet Union and began a complete reorganization of the party on the Soviet model, according to the principles of democratic centralism. The party then was restructured along very strict hierarchical lines, with loyalty and discipline to leadership and a militant use of propaganda and public demonstrations kind of being the key principles. But it's a somewhat uneasy alliance. Sun declares in 1923 that he doesn't really see communism as something that is suited to the conditions and problems faced by China. Still, Chinese Communist Party members were admitted as individuals and united with the Kuomintang in a quest to smash warlords and roll back imperialist powers, and their inclusion at the time matched the Kuomintang's aspirations to lead a broad, united front of various classes and interest groups in society, but to do so as a means to kind of avoid class war and the internal strife that would allow foreign powers to continue to exploit the nation. Beyond Sun, the Kuomintang drew strength in the 1920s and 1930s from a very cosmopolitan coastal areas that were thronged by a rising middle class. A middle class that was fluent in world affairs more so than previous generations. They were bankers, journalists, students, engineers, writers, physicians, shopkeepers, and factory managers. And they represented the formation of a new urban elite that was marked not by a scholar's blue robes, but instead by Western-style suits, bobbed haircuts, and especially the consumption of things like cigarettes. Ironically, many of them were educated abroad and attended China's colleges or elementary and middle schools founded by Protestant missionaries. They were among the quickest, though, to take the streets in the wake of events such as the May 30th incident, and they were scathing in their criticism of Western cultural imperialism. They were nativists. They rejected the notion that the recovery of Chinese strength would close or narrow its engagement with the wider world. Actually, they aspired to international respect and recognition, and from their own professional backgrounds and educational experiences, they expected that China's continued modernization would be heavily dependent on an openness to the outside world and an engagement with the international community. So they have kind of this relationship that has a parallel to the self-strengtheners and the late Qing reformers, and yet they reject the idea that the end goal is to eventually kind of narrow and make China's engagement with the world more selective and controlled again. They kind of think that that's Pandora's box. That's not something that's going to go back in. Attracting these groups, though, the Kuomintang is kind of the first movement by the mid-1920s to actually weaponize nationalism and make it work for them. They have mastered the new political tools to create a base for a modern political party. Aided by the talented CCCP, the Chinese Communist Party Corps in their ranks, the Kuomintang is the first to actually launch boycotts, incite public demonstrations, and use ultra-nationalist groups that are very violent to weaken warlords and intimidate foreign powers. And once in power, the Kuomintang is going to use these weapons to offset their lack of a military strength or economic might to rival those stronger powers like, say, Great Britain and Japan. These tools helped the GMT attain an end to the unequal treaties with the first many smaller powers, and then eventually the United States, and end extraterritoriality rights by the end of the Second World War. By 1931, the central government has also regained tariff autonomy. They've regained control of the maritime customs, the salt administration, the post office. These are all agencies that for much of the 1920s were in foreign hands during the warlord era. And they're able to do so in part by rallying the masses behind a promissory slogan to roll back imperialism. And another accomplishment that's quite notable is that they're able to reduce the foreign concessions, areas given to foreign powers that they rule over themselves, from 33 to 13 over quite a brief time. With the passing of Sun Zhongshan from cancer in 1925, the Kuomintang is going to splinter into various factions. On the left were ideologues such as politician Wang Jingwei and Sun Zhongshan's widow, Song Qingling, who we're going to kind of circle back to her and her family here in a second. And then on the right are militarists and conservatives who are going to coalesce around Chiang Kai-shek, or Zhang Jieshi. Zhang, as you read about, is from a merchant family that bought their gentry status in Ningbo, and he was first classically educated as a youth before later being exposed to modern education and military training in both Japan and the Soviet Union. His ascent to the upper echelons of the party is going to come with the Northern Expedition. The initial push towards Shanghai is going to allow for him to build up a power base of loyal allies to him in the lower Yangtze region. Taken for naive, he was actually quite suspicious of the fraternity between the Kuomintang's left and the CCP, or Chinese Communist elements in their ranks, and especially he was wary of the expansionist designs of the Soviets and their influence. Soviet aid and advisors had built the foundations of their party with the military to rival the warlords at the Whampoa Military Academy in Guangzhou in 1924. There, Soviet agents such as Michael Borden helped train Chinese nationalists in the art of propaganda, mass mobilization, and the creation of local cells and alliances with unions, youth leagues, and other radicals. Tools that were activated to launch a campaign with the great wave of nationwide anti-imperialist student demonstrations that began against the foreign powers in 1925. This positioned the Kuomintang for the Northern Expedition, where they're going to move from Guangzhou to the Yangtze Valley. Dozens of warlords eventually were absorbed by the Kuomintang's armies, with their troops and officers soon becoming part of the campaign's forces. This sudden influx of conservative militarists invested in the status quo is going to widen a split between those factions, left and right, within the party, rivaling for power since Sun's death in 1925. Now in Wuhan, as you've read about, the left wing of the Kuomintang worked closely with the Soviet advisors and the Chinese Communist Party to plan the campaigns and to foment popular agitation by peasants, workers, and youth that is going to lay the basis for the expansion of the armies. It was powerful in a political sense, but the actual strength of force, the military power, lay with Chiang Kai-shek and the rightists. In charge of the campaigns extending their control from Shanghai to Nanjing, Zhang and the rightists controlled a power base in the rich strategic center of China. His betrayal of the CCP agents paved the way for his victory in Shanghai by turning a rift within the GMD into an all-out quest to expel and exterminate the communists, and then build a new capital for Republican China in the south at Nanjing, which would reduce the power of northern China and its warlords. Chiang's move to betray the CCP and the leftist ranks within the Kuomintang reflected his belief that the revolution first should consolidate its gains in the south and prevent the unleashing of mass social revolution, where China would devolve into bitter class struggle, rural uprisings, and all kinds of unsettling social upheaval that would invite the intervention of foreign powers. In this sense, his element of the Kuomintang drew support from those invested in the current state of trade and relations with the larger world. They were industrialists, bankers, criminal gangs, and a lot of Western educated middle class that we just mentioned in the cities. It was not a movement that promised to reduce rents for peasant farmers or raise the wages or improve the conditions for urban workers. It was a movement that aspired to the following: military strength, the recovery of full sovereignty, and the creation of an industrial economy. Jiang represented the elements of the Kuomintang and its political base being built here in the south that were ill at ease with the agitation of unions and their bosses in cities for higher wages. Jiang, in this time, in 1927, skillfully consolidated and expanded his hold on China proper from the south to the north by exploiting knowledge of the feuds between various warlords. Warlords amenable to the Kuomintang and its ambitions were wooed with promises to allow them to retain power under the new government and aid them in crushing neighboring rivals that they had long fought against. And so whole warlord armies were going to soon walk into the Kuomintang camp, swelling its forces and the forces of the conservatives and their territorial hold on China. And after establishing a new capital in the south, in Nanjing, far from the power of the left or the warlords in the north, by the end of 1928, Zhang's forces were able to move into that northern region and eventually incorporate the powerful warlord Zhang Xueling into their ranks. And this is actually where I'm going to stop the first video for this lecture, because we've got quite a bit more to cover. So I'm going to pause it here, and then we'll take up from the next slide on the next video.